Aloha, Hawaii. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on mastering the next generation of Hawaii science standards. My name's Francis Vigent. I am CEO here at KnowAtom, and to kind of give you a sense of what we do and why STEM and why next generation science standards mean so much to us, the shift in standards and the trends sort of within education, whether it's science or ELA through performance-based testing, which most people have come to know as PARC, Common Core, and a whole bunch of other things, kind of all combined, smarter balance. The focus is shifting towards higher order thinking. And science, technology, engineering, and math, at least we here at KnowAtom believe, are the best disciplines to be able to teach students how to think critically, how to use those higher order thinking skills, and really develop an ability to create, evaluate, and analyze the way that scientists and engineers do. So when you think about that next generation inquiry environment that we're going to talk about here in a moment, you have to picture students as scientists and engineers. They're there learning how to think and how to think the way that scientists and engineers do, to go from a problem or a question to an evidence-based solution or answer. And so in that role of scientist and engineer, we're talking about an environment where students are engaging with the content, actually developing and using it. And that's the opportunity for authentic learning and students bringing their own ideas to life. So curriculum materials, professional development, things like this flow from there. That's where alignment to the standards really happens. The standards allow or create the space for teaching critical thinking and putting students into that role of scientist and engineer, and then the curriculum, the materials, professional development have to fit together kind of hand in glove, so that that inquiry environment is something that teachers are equipped with really targeted professional development, coherent and articulated and rigorous resources to provide the same to the students in terms of a coherent, articulated, and rigorous inquiry environment on an everyday basis and from one year to the next, in such a way that it's scaffolding from September through June, and also from pre-K all the way through grade 12. Another piece of it is really thinking about awareness of the value and nature of science, technology, engineering, and math. So consistent programming and support is going to be a key element of implementing these next generation science standards. So in the agenda for the next hour or so, what I want to do is take a little look at what makes the new next generation science standards a little tougher, thinking about teaching and learning the STEM cycle, not just as educators, but also as students, because that's the real key. I mean, as educators, we need to understand all of this, but the reason that we need to understand it is so that the result of our instruction is that students understand. Also, next, taking a look at how the new standards link to Common Core, ELA, and math in terms of that next generation inquiry environment and what that looks like, and how this switch to next generation science standards is going to impact the methods for science instruction K through 12. I'm going to talk a little bit at the end, not only about data, but before then I'll talk a bit about art and what a lot of folks are talking about as STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math, because there is a connection, and by teaching students how to be scientists and engineers and how to think scientifically, we're actually preparing them to engage and consume art more critically as well. And it's beyond just an aesthetic, so we'll talk about that. The first and foremost piece that you need to realize is that the next generation science standards bring in a very clear definition of the nature of science and engineering. So mastering the next generation science standards means understanding for yourself as an educator, but also that students understand what science is, what engineering is, and how there's a relationship and sort of a cycle that occurs between the two, because this is the foundation of innovation. It's also the foundation of supporting innovation. So if a student goes on to be a scientist, wonderful. If a student goes on to be a salesperson, wonderful. Salespeople support scientists. They support innovations. They need to be able to understand the technicalities of what it is they're selling, and that's true of marketing people, that's true of accountants, that's true of anybody. These are actually life skills. Thinking about this sort of STEM cycle, we like to call it a lot of times, science is defined as knowledge from experimentation. So scientists engage in asking questions and forming hypotheses and answering those questions through developing and using the data that results from experiments. They don't just plan an experiment and carry out that experiment. They take the data and they use it to form an evidence-based conclusion. So what you think about in this sort of model is that it does have a process framework to it. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but it's important to realize that there's a difference between practices and processes, and although there are processes involved in going from an idea, or really a question, to an evidence-based conclusion, by process we just mean there's logic. We're not saying that science is linear, we're not saying that engineering is linear. It's just you need to pursue and extend your own knowledge somewhat logically so that it can be replicable, and that's the role of process. Engineering, the role of engineers is to use that scientific knowledge to solve problems. So while scientists are conducting experiments, producing scientific knowledge, which you see here, engineers are using that knowledge to solve problems. And so when you think about it that way, the more knowledge that scientists develop and make available to engineers, the more problems engineers can solve. And engineers solve those problems by prototyping. They conceive of an idea, a potential solution, they prototype it, they test the prototype, they gather data in that testing process, and they use that data to decide whether the prototype needs to be refined or replicated. So you can see I'm describing a process. However, both science and engineering are iterative because, frankly, very rarely do scientists have their hypothesis confirmed. They learn something new, and they go back and they have to modify their hypothesis, try a new test, test something different. Engineers experience the same sort of thing. The prototype doesn't solve the problem as well as they need it to, or as well as they'd hoped it would, and so it needs to be refined before it can be replicated. And sometimes they have to toss the whole thing out. So that's where science and engineering are both iterative and they are nonlinear. And how a scientist chooses to iterate and how an engineer chooses to iterate within those processes is how it becomes nonlinear, kind of tangential, we might say. So process has its place. The product of engineering, when something it doesn't need to be refined, it actually solves the problem and it can be scaled, that's what technology is. It's the product of engineering. And technology enables scientists to ask deeper questions, new questions. It basically exposes these questions. At the same time, it helps scientists answer questions that they couldn't previously answer. So if you think about engineers solving the problem of getting sensors into outer space, to planets that people have never been able to visit, and the probes have never been able to orbit, those tools, that technology, exposes information, collects data. It offers scientists access to collect data they couldn't collect previously, and therefore to test hypotheses they could never test. and grow that base of scientific knowledge and so on. So this, I spent so much time on this just to relay to you that this is the foundation of these standards, and it's really important to understand that and internalize it, because your students need to understand, whether they are kindergartners or 12th grade students, they need to understand the difference between science and engineering and how the two relate. The reason you see math in the center is that math is a primary tool for quantifying observations, really capturing them, analyzing them, and communicating them. And so through structuring planned investigations and using precision and math this way, you can communicate your work as a scientist or as an engineer. Your work can be verified by others, it can be replicated, it can be scaled, and it can become the foundation for others' work as well. So again, key components here that students need to understand at its very foundation under these new standards. Now, thinking about kind of the key action items in Hawaii right now, well, we have to think about the fact that Hawaii is, at this point in time, probably the latest adopter, just in February of 2016, of these next generation science standards. They adopted them, in their totality, which is really great, because the way these standards are designed, they are a system of content, a system of skills, a system of systems, in fact. And so to segment them or change them in some way, the way that West Virginia has, the way that in some cases California has, and Massachusetts has in many cases, it begins to degrade the value, and it makes things more difficult. So Hawaii didn't do that, which is really fantastic. Now, the intended implementation of the standards is supposed to start in 2016-17 school year. However, when they were adopted, the idea was that implementation would be part of a kind of 4-year timeline. And so that is kind of forthcoming in terms of how that all comes together. But the Hawaii Department of Education really wants implementation within 4 years. So it could be a 3-year, but nonetheless, frankly, what most states have done is they've taken kind of a 3-year approach where they encourage everybody to adopt or begin aligning and adopting the new standards kind of ASAP, with the idea that you learn from your implementation. As you try to align your curriculum, you start to realize that there are shifts, and that the alignment isn't quite as easy as alignment was under previous standards, because these are 3-dimensional standards, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. And if you try to just implement in a single year, what happens is everybody gets very frustrated, because frankly, taking the kind of resources that have traditionally been available through purchasing from companies, or even what teachers have downloaded off the internet or created themselves, tend to follow this kind of 3-unit a year, 4-unit a year model that doesn't really fit with the structure of these new standards. So what you might be used to under the current Hawaii content and performance standards for science, and just flash an example from grade 5 up there, the new standards are going to look considerably different. The way that the strands are kind of articulated right now, scientific process is kind of off on its own as a strand, and it has its own sort of topics, benchmarks, and so on, inquiry, unifying concepts and themes, and so on, and kind of a rubric for each of these kind of expectations. So what's different when you look at, and then you of course would be hopefully integrating this across the other content dimensions like physical, earth, space science, and so on. But because it's separate, it's sort of easy to think of it separately and have kind of earth, space, and physical science in a silo on its own, and then kind of think about, okay, inquiry over here too, so I have to kind of find a way to address that. The next generation science standards display standards differently to really try and hit home and also illustrate for educators that the standard itself is multidimensional and shouldn't exist in a silo. These different dimensions don't exist in a silo. So something like inquiry doesn't exist on its own. I'll explain what I mean by that here. So when you look at this performance expectation, so what you see up top, 5-LS2-1, this is a performance expectation from the next generation science standards. And the difference between a standard and a performance expectation is really big, actually. And it's kind of funny that they call them next generation science standards because they're actually performance expectations, and they call them that within the documentation. It's just kind of this kind of quirky thing. So a standard is typically seen as something that is a standalone, fact-based kind of metric in a sense, where students must be able to identify the difference between sedimentary, igneous, and metamorphic rock. That is a standard. In this case, so performance expectations are what students are going to be expected to demonstrate. So students have to be able to produce evidence of instruction in a context. So learning in context is really key for mastery of the performance expectations. So that's what you see again in white. What's below it are what's called the 3 dimensions, or in the standard documentation, these are called foundation boxes. So the performance expectation has a foundation in 3 dimensions. Okay, the first dimension you see here, science and engineering practices, is a skills dimension. What that means is that these are skills that students are going to be expected to use and demonstrate as part of performing the expectation that you see above. So the way this really plays out in reality is that students need to develop these skills. Okay, so think about that as a tool set, because the practices are finite. There's a set of practices, which are these tools, which students use to develop and use the content. Now this is the content dimension you see here in orange, the disciplinary core ideas. So think about it as students use these tools, such as the ability to develop a model to describe phenomenon, and the ability to use science explanations to describe the mechanisms for natural events. Those are tools that a student uses in order to develop and use the idea of interdependent relationships in ecosystems and how matter and energy transfers in ecosystems and cycles through the environment. Okay, so you can picture this here, the context of this, as ecosystems, food chains, food webs. You can look outside your window wherever you are, and you are viewing some type of ecosystem. It may be an urban ecosystem, it may be a rainforest ecosystem, it may be a marine ecosystem, so on. But nonetheless, a student should be able to use their skills to develop and use that content, and through that they are able to see cross-cutting concepts. Cross-cutting concepts are what's called a kind of a systems dimension of the standard. So for instance, something like inputs and outputs, cycles, these are all sort of system components that is kind of a behavior of content. So ecosystems have many cycles that you find within them. Things like, well, you find life cycles, you find cycles of energy and matter transfer. You also find oxygen cycles. You find things like even water cycle, if as you start to build it out, rock cycle and things like this. In this particular case, though, what they're hoping, it's not really hoping, what they're going to require is that a student is going to be able to articulate and understand a system can be described in terms of its components and their interaction. So as a student who has these practices that are developing and using this content, they should be able to describe that system, that content, in terms of its components and their interactions. So an example of that would be like a food chain or food web. They should be able to look at an ecosystem and say, those are producers, those are consumers. This is, the source of the energy, and here's how the energy is transferring. This is a keystone species, and so on. So that's what we're talking about here. Thinking about it as a system, but also as components of a system, and thinking about how they interact comes into play when you think about, again, what happens when you remove one of the players or one of the components of that system, or you increase it or you decrease it. How does that one component affect other aspects of the system? For instance, increasing the number of predators or decreasing the number of predators, increasing the amount of sunlight, decreasing, eliminating a species of plant or animal. How does that affect energy flow? How does that affect the other sort of pieces of the system? So when you think about how you articulate your lessons in your units, it's really important that you think about moving away from a traditional model of instruction, if that is the kind of model that you have had, and towards a next generation model. And the two are very different. So to kind of compare and contrast here, a traditional model of instruction is a model where the content flows through the teacher, and the teacher acts almost like a valve. And they are modeling facts, demonstrating phenomena, and explaining what concepts are all about. It's kind of that pre-teach, that model, that demonstrate type of instruction. Now, the students in that traditional model, their role is to absorb it all. Because by absorbing it all, they are, in that traditional model, going to be able to repeat back what they've heard in terms of an explanation. They're going to be able to demonstrate the phenomenon, explain the phenomenon, and explain the facts, repeat the facts back. So when you think about it, it's all recall focused. So this model, there's many issues with this model. One, it's not particularly engaging. And there is a lot of sort of quasi-traditional things that happen, the real things that kind of masquerade as next generation, which aren't. So for instance, there are a lot of kits that call themselves next generation, which put materials in front of students, and they'll basically have a worksheet or a series of diagrams or a list of procedures or something like that, steps and procedures, which students carry out. And all that's effectively doing is transferring the demonstration from the teacher kind of doing it in front of a group to the students doing it in front of themselves. What's not happening, which needs to happen, is the students need to plan the investigation so it's authentic, so it's their idea. And so not only is that engaging, but it's also helping the student develop those skills, practice those skills, and get to a mastery level on these performance expectations, because they are actually performing the expectations in the classroom. That's really key. So what a next generation model looks like is like this. You see the relationship between students, teachers, and content is very different. What's happening here is students are developing those skills, and they're using them to develop and use the content and observe and learn the cross-cutting concepts in context. Very, very different. There's not a pre-teaching or handing out of facts or model and repeat with a teacher between the student and the content. The teacher's role here is necessary, it's absolutely vital, but it's even more skilled. What happens is that the teacher is playing the role of, well, first of all, helping students understand the expectations of a scientist or an engineer. They are helping them to develop those skills they're helping to set basically a bar of expectations and then help the students reach that bar. And the way that they do that is through redirecting and monitoring students in this environment, so that there is a full release of responsibility, but it's not a full release of responsibility without accountability, and that's key. The teacher is that piece of accountability for those students. The students are coming through checkpoints, and they are presenting their work to the teacher, and the teacher is creating a culture of critique in the classroom, one that's an academic critique, and questioning the student's work. And what that does is it helps the student understand, first and foremost, what the expectation is, but secondly, that there's an adult that takes their ideas seriously, and secondly, that if they're going to write something down, they really need to think about it, because other people are going to think about it, other people are going to question them about it, and that's part of making progress through a plan, and then a plan which you can use to carry out an investigation, and they should do that. They shouldn't just plan investigations, they should use their own plans, carry them out, gather their data, and use that data to form an evidence-based conclusion from their idea. So the teacher is really vital here. They're gradually adjusting supports in the sense of differentiating, because really you should be picturing students in small groups, teams of 2 doing this. So at least the way we structure this type of environment, students start with nonfiction reading, and then they go through Socratic dialogue as a group with the class, and so teachers are helping to ask higher order questions that are getting students to create, evaluate, and analyze in their responses. And then what they're doing is they are looping other students into the class into that discussion, so that it's really students critiquing students, and they're building that culture of critique and sharpening those critical thinking skills. And so the expectations of a student and how a student demonstrates proficiency, and this is why they're called performance expectations, is that they have to be able to develop and use the content. They have to be able to demonstrate their skills in solving problems as engineers and answering questions as scientists. They also have to be able to describe and relate content in terms of how that content is related and interacts as a system. And so that's where the content as well as the cross-cutting concepts really come into play here too. And I'll show you some examples of what the next generation aligned standardized testing and standardized test items look like that are being employed in some other states, just so you can get an idea of how, whether it's a standardized test or not, how students are being assessed on these types of skills, because they aren't the typical kind of fill-in-the-blank right answer, wrong answer type skills that are being in what's being required here. It's actually much above that. So thinking again about the standards, the biggest shift for people are actually these science and engineering practices in general, because they're not, the standards here, even though there are some grade level specific standards, they can't be taught in isolation. It's not the kind of thing where you can say, okay, these are the standards for my grade level, I'm going to just teach these, and that's going to be sufficient, because it's not. Same thing, you can't just, okay, we're going to develop a model to describe phenomena here. There are actually other practices which are relevant and useful to students really being able to operate at a mastery level, demonstrating their understanding. So I'm going to kind of explain how that works, but these practices rely on each other. These are the 8 STEM practices. So at a high level, there's 8 of them, and these are the expectations of students, the skills that students are going to be required to be able to demonstrate as a result of instruction in the classroom. So a student is going to need to be able to ask a question, not just ask a question, but ask ask questions scientifically, and that being in the context of science, also defining problems in the context of engineering. Not only using a model, which I was mentioning earlier, following instructions basically is using a model, but actually developing a model. So when we think about labs, it's not just using a lab, it's actually developing a lab. Not only carrying out an investigation, but planning it. Not only interpreting data, but really analyzing it. Computational mathematical thinking come into play because as you plan an investigation, then you carry out an investigation, and then you analyze that data and form an evidence-based conclusion. That all requires a sense of scale, a sense of the proper operations, and a sense of everything from orders of magnitude to kind of how you segment resources, recursive steps, and all kinds of other things as well. Constructing explanations, so that's evidence-based conclusions in a scientific context, and designing solutions, so that prototyping within engineering. And engineers also construct explanations, by the way. They use data from the solutions they design, right? Engaging an argument from evidence is sort of the, we don't have culminating activities under next generation science standards, at least we shouldn't, because we should be learning through the experience of engaging in the practices, having rigorous environments that have a scope and sequence that help connect these ideas and so on. So it's not about reading everything to learn, it's about actually experiencing and wrestling with the questions and problems. Engaging an argument from evidence is all about taking the results of your ideas, those conclusions, as student teams, and engaging in argument from evidence with your peers. So here's how we approach the problem. Here was our solution. Here's the data we got. Here's why it was effective, and here's why it was efficient, and so on, how it met the needs, and then looking at other solutions and saying, actually that may have been a more efficient way, or this was less efficient, or so on and so forth. So really think, but here's why. And in some cases, something that's less efficient may be the better solution because of other factors. So that becomes, again, a culture of critique among teams in a class. And again, this is something that's appropriate at all grade levels. What's different, and these STEM practices are relevant and appropriate for all grade levels, what changes is the depth and complexity of how students are able to apply them. Okay, that's what changes. And of course, the context in the classroom should change in depth and complexity as you go from one year to the next. That's part of that vertical nurturing process that's so important. And of course, obtaining, evaluating, communicating information is, I guess, obviously a part of all of this. So when you think about a second grade classroom, you might think about, students in this kind of role. So their class, they've gone through nonfiction reading, Socratic dialogue, and they've come to a question, and they are now investigating that question through a plan that they participated in creating. Now at the K1-2 level, there's going to be more structure around that plan so that there might be parts that are facilitated so that students do have ownership and they are putting their ideas into it, but certain things that may be less developmentally appropriate are not going to be made a barrier to their success. But they're going to be able to observe them, use them, and understand their place and significance. So these two students here are engaged in carrying out their plan, and at this point they are cataloging the different species of animals and looking at where the owl is in the food chain in relation to other animals that are a part of its diet, and then relating those back to their place sort of between consumers and producers and so on. Now when you think about that transition between sort of a more structured to a less structured environment, we really at all grade levels are going for a full release of responsibility. But what's important is to understand that, well, first of all, children are typically capable of more than adults ever expect of them. So there's an awful lot that children can do. However, when we think about that structure, the purpose of the structure is really to try and produce enough structure to just help accommodate what the children can't do either developmentally or for another reason. So it's really in the spirit of something like you might think of an IEP. The role of an IEP is not to remove the expectations from the student, but it's to remove the barriers of a language-based learning disability or something like that from the student's ability to engage the content. So again, that's really the role of structure here. But beginning in 4th grade, at least in our case, the way we approach it is students at the 4th grade level have that structure, a lot of structure removed, and they're actually working in blank laboratory notebooks. And so this is an example of what that looks like. This is a little older than 4th grade. This is more for 5th and 6th grade. But nonetheless, think about it this way. These two students, I can tell by what's on their lab notebook there, that they are engaged as engineers. They've gone through their reading, they've gone through their Socratic dialogue as a class, they've come to this problem or question that then the teams break up, and they, as two students, are using those skills, and they're thinking about the available materials, and they are trying to bring their minds together, take what they know and extend it into a solution to that problem with the available materials. And so they're going to go through and identify different possible prototypes, pick one, diagram it, build it, and then test it. So engineers don't always build physical things, but so for instance, software is engineered. That's non-physical. Processes are engineered. Quality control processes are engineered. Those are non-physical. Things that are electronic are engineered, but also things that are non-electronic are engineered. Staplers, doorknobs, anything that solves a problem for humans is technology. So when you think about these students engaging as engineers, they have to recognize it that way. And so what they produce as a prototype has to yield data. They have to be able to test it and get data, otherwise it's crafting. And the goal of engineering is not crafting, it's to create a prototype, test it, gather data, and be able to form an evidence-based conclusion about whether or not that prototype solves the problem so that it can be replicated or should be replicated. Otherwise, it should be refined, and that's where things become iterative. So 4th grade is a big transition year in general, between developmentally especially, where these kinds of things can happen. So in Hawaii, as you're thinking about developing your curriculum, taking your existing units and aligning them to next generation science standards perhaps, you need to think about the fact that those practices are going to be part of every grade level, that these are performance expectations that exist in a three-dimensional context, and your classroom should be that context. Not that students are engaging in a culminating activity after reading a whole bunch of things and talking about them, but in fact that reading about something and talking about it is just a little sort of springboard into an experience that brings those dimensions all together, and a student can begin to try to demonstrate or try to perform an expectation and ultimately becomes a master at demonstrating their understanding because they have, through these experiences, developed such a robust framework of understanding, and that's really what we're going for here. Now, these next generation science standards are naturally integrated because they were designed to be. They're naturally integrated specifically with Common Core ELA and Common Core Math. Now, they also integrate with social justice, they integrate with history, social studies, art. They integrate with all kinds of disciplines, but those points of connection are not as explicit as the ELA and math connections. Now, when you think about this kind of pink or red circle, you should think about science time on learning, and ELA time on learning, and math time on learning as they correspond. And so the only bit that is purely science time on learning is the experimenting and the prototyping itself, the physical experimenting and prototyping. The ELA and math components that overlap are the Common Core technical subject standards in ELA, the communication standards, the writing standards, nonfiction reading, so on. All of those standards are relevant to an effective next generation inquiry environment. The math Common Core math practices as well as standards are relevant, but those practices very closely mirror the science and engineering practices that we just looked at. These practices kind of fit hand in glove with the Common Core math practices. There's also a lot of applied math, data collection, analysis. You can think of analysis as when do I apply mean, median, and mode, finding a difference of an average as a way of going from a data collection piece, which is sort of measurement and quantifying observations, to actually boiling that down to one or two specific figures that are useful for supporting a claim and reasoning that claim, and then also things like graphing and so on. So really important to realize that all of these disciplines benefit from those higher order thinking skills, which when we put the student into the role of scientist and engineer, creating, evaluating, and analyzing becomes so vital. So this is a reorganization of Bloom's taxonomy slightly, just to, again, hopefully drive home for you that creating, evaluating, and analyzing happens simultaneously in these new next generation science standards, that sort of the aspirations of many former standards and really curriculum, and especially commercially produced curriculum, is that students will remember, understand, and apply what they've learned. Well, frankly, these new standards are aimed at students creating, evaluating, and analyzing content and context, and that's huge. They happen simultaneously, which is why we put those higher order thinking skills on the same level. If you think about those students, they have a problem to wrestle with. They have to create a way to try and solve it. They have to evaluate what they've created. They have to analyze the data. They have to apply what they've learned. They have to obviously understand some of the concepts and remember them, but that applying, understand, and remember is not sufficient in order to be able to get from a problem to an evidence-based solution, or from a question to a evidence-based conclusion. Okay, so as you're looking, so I would, some resources I would recommend is the Peak Alignment Guide, P-E-E-C, so there's two E's in there. I'd also recommend to you the EQUIP rubric for science. Both of those resources are great for looking at your existing curriculum system, lesson plans, and understanding to what degree they are aligned or are not aligned, and basically what you need to do to get them into alignment. We use those resources. What we create, we align, to EQUIP and Peak guidelines. But what I think those resources do really well is, point out what the expectations are from a higher order thinking perspective and how things need to be articulated, because it's not just about a particular lesson. It's about how entire grade levels and entire school systems kind of line themselves up to nurture students over the course of their academic career, and how a really robust curriculum operates within the year as well, because it relies and creates opportunities for students to engage these higher order thinking skills on an everyday basis. When you look at the types of assessments and the way that that the next generation science standards should be assessed in the classroom, and as it relates to the standardized testing, which often follows, because anytime you have a change in standards, you also want to be able to assess the effects of those changes, and there are different ways that can come into play. But what I wanted to give you an example of is inquiry assessments that currently exist, even not in complete alignment to the next generation science standards, which closely mirror what we do see being produced in alignment. So scenario-based, performance-based testing, and this is an example from the New England Common Assessment Program, this is an example from the Rhode Island edition. However, it's used in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island. There are also other versions that are used all over the country, because it's produced by Measured Progress, which is a company that is one of the kind of major bidders of standardized testing in the U.S. and actually internationally. But nonetheless, the way that it's structured, you can see a student is given a scenario, and then it follows really the scientific process. So you have materials for the investigation, there's sort of a hypothesis in here, you have a procedure and so on, and then students are asked a series of questions related to that, which you see over here. You know, they have data that they've collected actually in that assessment. Students follow the procedure, they generate their own data, and then they demonstrate different skills in terms of how that data becomes organized, how it's used, and then again also mathematical operations and so on. So this isn't in complete alignment with the next generation science standards. I'll show you one from DC that is, but what I want to point out is that this type of performance-based assessment is what should be happening in the classroom, that you're basically creating a scenario with information, and then the student, as a result of instruction, who has developed an understanding of the content, who has developed the skill set and an understanding of the processes, can unpack that scenario and can use the data to kind of think about it, form a bit of a conclusion in their mind, and reflect on it scientifically, or as an engineer would. And so what you see is a movement from these types of lower order thinking questions, which you see on the left, to higher order thinking questions, which you see on the right. So even things like, when clear ice melts, which of the characteristics change? That's a lower order thinking question because it just requires students to remember the connection between a phase shift and matter. Same thing with the second one, and these are, you know, 4th grade level, what I'm showing you here. And this is another reason I picked this, is to kind of show some different grade levels. The idea that reflection is light bouncing off of a surface versus being absorbed or allowed to pass through or bent in some way. So again, if you can remember the definition of reflection, basically, you know, we might say this is applying. Okay, so, you know, kind of 3 steps up on that, but still not a higher order thinking piece. It's inadequate. It's not really what these next generation science standards are going for. They're going for something much deeper, which is the content in a context and students using skills to kind of wrestle with that, unpack it, and so on. So I want to show you how DC, the District of Columbia, has approached this. As of May 2016, Washington, D.C. will be the first state, even though it's a territory, I suppose, or a district, is the first state to have not only adopted the NGSS, but have implemented NGSS-aligned science assessments at grades 5, 8, and 10 in high school biology. And they're doing a computer-based model where you know, they have some what they call tech-enabled items, where it's basically just an ability to drag and drop things. But it's still open response, which are considered, they're called constructed responses, and selected response, which is multiple choice. But they look a lot differently than what we saw here with these kind of multiple choice. So let me show you what that looks like. Here you can see a scenario about 2 fictional students, and this is a grade 5 example, Trevor and Kayla. And, you know, they go to a school where there's a garden, and they plant some beans, and they have ideas, they have hypotheses or questions at least about the difference between growing beans hydroponically or naturally in soil, or more traditionally in soil. And there's some steps that have been laid out here, and this is really, you know, there's opportunity to improve on the way this assessment is structured. For instance, here's a procedure, but there are no chronological indicators, sort of steps or anything like that, so it defies what a basic expectation of a procedure would include. However, here it is. So a student needs to be able to look at the scenario, basically understand what's being presented, and then over here the student is told, here's some data. Trevor and Kayla observed their plants and gathered data on the bean plants in soil and those in water, and Trevor came to this conclusion while Kayla came to a different conclusion. Study the data tables, and Trevor and Kayla's claims is what's told to the real student who's taking this assessment, and the real student engaged in the assessment is asked whose claim is correct, Trevor or Kayla. Explain why Kayla or Trevor's claim is correct. Use evidence to support your choice. So what's being asked here is for students to construct a response using their skills, extracting the information, evaluating the claim of others, making a judgment on it, creating a response. So you can see there's analysis, students creating the response, so they're analyzing, creating, and they're also evaluating the claims of others here. So I mean, you can see it all coming together. When it comes to things like multiple choice, well, let me show you first. You have multiple choice on the right. On the left, you have, because this is a computer-based assessment, the one I'm showing you, they have this ability for what's called tech-enhanced items. So here, students are going to have to drag and drop organisms into this food web. And then they're going to be asked to make a constructed response about where, this is a poorly framed question again. I think they could use a little help with their questions, but explain where the model shows the shortest way that energy travels from plants to the fox. So down the bottom you would have plants, up the top you would have fox, and so the student would be asked to explain how this path through the left from the bottom is the shortest path, because there are only 2 energy and matter transfers versus 3 in all other paths, which are on the right. And so that would be a constructed response down the bottom. On the right, you can see, and again, I want to point out that Trevor and Kayla are still part of the narrative. This is another key kind of shift that we see with these next generation assessments, is that it's really one giant narrative versus, here's a bunch of random questions, and then if there's sort of an inquiry item, a little bit of a narrative, okay? Even the multiple choices have more narrative with them than traditional multiple choices. And in fact, to get away from students sort of getting lucky and eliminating answers, you can see that the multiple choice are now select 3 and not select 1. And the purpose of that is to get away from those traditional models of instruction where children are taught to eliminate wrong answers. And so, that's fine to teach that to children. However, that can skew test results, because if a student can eliminate wrong answers, they don't necessarily understand the correct answer, they just understand what's not correct. And that is important, but it skews the results. So this is a kind of a tricky way of getting around that. What I want to point out, though, is that here you can see a food chain. Previously we saw a food web. Here we see a food chain, and the students are being asked to describe which of the following statements best describes the matter of movement in the pond food chain. Select the 3 correct answers, so that's a multiple choice. And then down the bottom, they are being asked to use the model of the food chain to describe the relationship between organisms in the pond and the exchange of matter back into the environment. So here, students need to be able to look at the situation, again employing those skills, using their understanding of the content and their understanding of the systems, and realize that this is a food chain, but when matter gets recycled into the environment, we actually are starting to have a life cycle take place, and that's its own kind of food chain. So for instance, if a minnow dies, it is going to be decomposed by the bacteria, and its matter is going to be returned to the environment, okay, which will then be nutrients for the algae, and the algae will feed future minnows, which will feed future perch, and so on. So higher order thinking again at play, skills again at play, and understanding process is again very valuable. So I won't labor on this much longer, except to say whether or not there's a future Hawaii assessment that is exactly what you see here is kind of irrelevant. What's irrelevant is to understand that this is how people are kind of coalescing. This is the model that people are coalescing around for assessing next generation science standards. So whether it's at a state level or at a classroom level, this is the type of assessment you should be aiming at. Now, those connections to Common Core, ELA, and math, those students, as they're creating their plan, they're creating a non-fiction document. They're also engaging in process writing. They are engaging in peer review and collaboration and all those, the 4 C's and so on. The Common Core technical subject standards, I pulled a few out just to sort of illustrate for you that you can see that students in that environment are going to have to, use evidence, cite evidence from text to support analysis of science. They're going to have to summarize text distinct from prior knowledge. They're going to have to follow precisely a multi-step procedure. So a point I want to make with that is that if you give a procedure to a student, or you buy a program which has procedures which are printed and handed to students, or kind of step-by-step charts, as what always happens, that's the way it works, or there's some kind of a note-taking, you write it on the board and kids copy it down. Following precisely a multi-step procedure is not science, it is ELA. And that's key. When the students develop the procedure, that's science. When the students follow the procedure, that's ELA. Another piece of an ELA technical subject standard, expressing information visually, distinguishing among facts, reasoned judgment, and speculation in text. That's that kind of argumentation from evidence, that peer discourse that we were talking about earlier. On the math side, I mentioned Common Core math practices kind of fit hand in glove. Here they are. Make sense of problems, persevere in solving them, reason abstractly, construct viable arguments, critique the reasoning of others, model with math, using tools strategically and appropriately. A tool is not just a hammer saw. A tool is mean, median, mode, basic operations. Tools are the actual science and engineering practices themselves. Tools are the process, the scientific process, the engineering design process. Those are all tools. Use the wrong tool, you don't get a result that's desirable. You may not get results at all. Using tools strategically as well as appropriately get you the results that you hope to get, not necessarily what you expect, but you're going to be collecting data accurately, and you're actually going to get data to collect. Mention accurately, attending to precision, looking for and making use of structure, processes structure, okay, procedure, those procedures that students create, their plans that they create, that's all examples of structure. Expressing regularity and repeated reasoning, how students create their plans efficiently using recursive steps and plans in procedures. That's an example of expressed regularity. So why, or where does this all come from? There's a new definition of effective STEM instruction which underpins, just like that nature of science and engineering, underpins all the next generation science standards. So effective science instruction, this is their definition, and it's a shift from what you see on the left to what you see on the right. The left being that traditional model of, I'm going to show you students, here's how we do it, I'm going to model it for you, and then you go do it, to the students being in that situation. We don't know how to do it, but we can figure it out because we have some knowledge about this that we can extend. We have some skills that we can use, and we understand how logically you get from a problem to a solution. So the definition is effective science instruction capitalizes on students' early interest and experiences. That means it starts in pre-K, kindergarten, intentionally nurtures students all the way through high school. Identifies and builds on what they know, again, an intentional nurturing process from one grade level to the next, but also within the year. Because when you scaffold your units appropriately, not 3 a year of, whatever, but really focused, monthly themes, for instance, and those broke down into weekly lessons where a lesson is not just a day, it's actually an experience that takes place over multiple days. It has multiple parts, and those standards are grouped so that you are introducing, mastering, and reinforcing standards not only from the grade level, if they're grade level specific, but from adjacent grade levels, so it's not a long-term scaffold kind of once and done. So what you're doing is you are able to identify by creating and thoughtfully articulating that you know what students have been exposed to, you can build on that, and then you can, through Socratic dialogue and through the nonfiction reading laying a little bit of a foundation, that the Socratic dialogue then kind of driving home through higher order thinking and higher order questioning, concept to concept connections, concept to world connection, concept to self connections. That is that identifying and building process, and then the release of responsibility is really placing trust in the students, but also placing the expectation on them that they will, this is student-centered, they will build on what they know as well. And so it's actually it's very empowering if you do it right. And so you provide students with the experiences to engage them in the practices. And the practices are those practices that I described earlier, where, and I'll just pull them up real quick for you again. These are the practices. So the students have to be engaged in developing, planning, analyzing, thinking, asking, defining, all these things. That's part of this effective science environment. And sustaining their interest means rigor. It means thoughtful articulation, because when students are empowered to bring their ideas to life, and when things are thoughtfully articulated in terms of how concepts scaffold, then students begin to make those connections themselves. They are not only engaged, but their interest is sustained too over time. I had mentioned art. So when you think about art, I bring this up because it's really important. A lot of people talk about STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math. And unfortunately, I think a lot of folks kind of, drive off the road a little bit and get stuck in the mud because they think that the connection between STEM and art, or science and engineering and art, is aesthetics. The idea that, engineers build cars, design cars, and artists make them pretty. Art is really not about aesthetics. Artists often develop an aesthetic, sort of a style. However, the art itself is engineered communication. I bring this piece up because Pablo Picasso is incredibly famous. This piece is incredibly famous and well known as well, not because it's pretty. And Pablo Picasso is not famous because he made things pretty. He did have an aesthetic that was specific to him. However, it wasn't, these things didn't become famous because they were pretty, and he did not end up living in exile because he made things pretty. And artists, when you think about artists, oftentimes artists are persecuted. They can end up in jail, sometimes worse. The reason that that happens is because artists engineer communication within a medium, whether it's dance, whether it's music, whether it's oil on canvas or sculpture. What Pablo Picasso did here with Guernica is he made a statement about the atrocities the fascists committed at Guernica in Spain, his home. He lived in exile from Spain because he was making statements about these atrocities in his artwork, and this is an example. He was commissioned to do a piece for an international art exposition, 1937, and he created a piece about the atrocities at Guernica to make it visible to the world and to say to the fascists that what you're doing is known and it's not right, and this is what it looks like. And in fact, there's, whether it's true or whether it's myth, it's said that the fascists came to Pablo after they saw this piece, and they said to him, "What did you do?" Well, he was living in exile, and he said to them, "I didn't do it, but you did." And so you can see that the level of skill, of the ability to create, evaluate, and analyze what was happening in the world, and the audience, the international audience as well as the audience of fascists, that he was able to say exactly what he meant in this piece by employing those higher order thinking skills, which, by the way, as I've shown you before, is employing those science and engineering practices, that precision, that obtaining, evaluating, communicating information, so on. So at its root, it's all thinking. And so by training students to think critically in the context of science, we're training them to be better artists, we're training them to be really better communicators, as well as consumers of communication, more critical thinkers, really, at their root. So I won't riff on this much longer, except to say that there's a close tie, but what happens is that when we think about English language arts, the English language is an art. The practices, so writing is a great example. Writing has practices and processes. Practices of writing are word choice, voice, tone, punctuation, so on. The process of writing is how you go from an idea to a high-quality published work, brainstorming, pre-writing, editing, peer review, so on, incorporating those edits and then publishing. So the process and the practices need each other. And that's how you go from an idea to a published work. The practices of science and engineering are the tools. The processes of science and engineering are how you go from a problem to an evidence-based solution. And so there's a close relationship. And so as a writer, to become a bestseller, you have to be able to communicate skillfully. You can think of someone like Charles Dickens, who wrote A Christmas Carol. Now, regardless of religion and such, think about the contribution that Charles Dickens made. Instead of trying to raise money for poverty or trying to, gift his time or so on to that, what he did was he wrote a story that communicated so much about inequality and about the plight of the poor and sort of the relationship between the rich and the poor at the time that he lived, and in such a way and with such precision that it was able to speak to such a broad audience that year after year after year, ever since that's been published, that people think about A Christmas Carol, and it returns them to a point where they focus on wealth inequality and the plight of folks who are unfortunate. And so that is the opportunity we have too here with the Next Generation Science students, is to really broaden student skill sets even outside of science. And we've talked about that, I guess, quite at length at this point. So just in wrapping up here, I want to show you a little bit of data and kind of pull it together for you. So the curriculum, so if you think about it, this is just examples from us because it's what I have access to here. If you'd like to see any examples, you can go to KnowAtom.com, go to the top of the page, it says STEM curriculum. You can access that, download. What you'll download is about a month's worth of content. There's a teacher's component and a student's component, and you can kind of see what that looks like. That's, we think of that as real curriculum. It's rigorous, it's supporting effective STEM instruction, supporting educators in the classroom, and so on. It's aligned to EQIP and PEAK and so on and so forth. But what it is that's kind of the foundation. So curriculum forms a foundation of support and rigor, scope and sequence, vocabulary, teacher background, lessons, so on. Professional development's role, it has to fit hand in glove because teachers need to understand how to implement best practices and mapping skill sets over and things like this. Materials, so you think about hands-on materials, that has to fit hand in glove as well to enable, you really want students working in a project-based environment to work hands-on, especially at those early grades. So you need to have everything you need to engage hands-on available to you, and such that it fits with your lessons and so on. So that's really the role of materials. All of it makes that STEM learning environment possible. So alignment to the standards, it starts at the standards, it starts at this focus on higher order thinking and the nature of science and engineering and what effective STEM instruction is, putting students into the role of science and a scientist and engineer, and then actually providing the training and the resources to educators in order to make that happen. So what does that look like even under current testing that's in place? Here's some examples from New Hampshire going all the way back to 2008, where our groups were in green and in blue, and then the state averages were in orange and in purple, and you can see 10 to 20 some odd % over state average. And when we drill into the subgroups, and I don't want to keep you too much longer because I know you probably have to get to class. And I'm happy to take any questions if you have them, but you can see in purple and in yellow, each of the inquiry, life science, earth science, physical science, that those groups are performing 10 to 30% over state average as well. And then in other places where the first language is not English, there's 72% low income, 65% free and reduced lunch, 75% high needs. You can see still positive trends in this particular school. What I really like about it is that the state average is 50% here. So despite being 72% low income, 75% high needs, and 35% whose first language is in English, these students added 51 points over 2.5 years. And we're basically performing at 90% proficient, almost twice the state average. And slightly, in more privileged environments, you see similar things happening, moving from state average to well above state average and sustaining that reduction in needs improvement warning level students. Same thing here, positive trend. So when you think about the potential impact of these standards on student learning, regardless of socioeconomics in Hawaii, that students from wealthy and privileged communities, as well as students who are not from wealthy, privileged communities, do have the opportunity to reach the same achievement levels if they're given the opportunity to and the resources are made available. And here's another example. I think this is a 22-point gain and sustained over time. This is in Massachusetts. This is the highest scoring district on the state standardized testing. You can see even they got a gain, which brought them to #1. In really difficult environments, and this is another one where I'll show you the demographics in 1 second, over the course of 2 years they added like 24 points. And this is a large urban district, a very inner city, UN High Council on Refugee Relocation point, and they have reached the average of their peers in peer cities. There are 26 large cities in Massachusetts of this nature, and they went from really bottom of the bottom to middle of the pack and hopefully continue on, because this is the most recent test data that's available. And just to show you how needy of a district or school that was, 95% low income, 87% free lunch, 97% high needs, and so on. You can see how the warning and failing students dropped from 59% to 27%. So thinking is powerful. I guess that's the big takeaway I hope you get here, is that teaching students to think empowers them for life, and that regardless of whether or not there's a state assessment, whether or not that is next generation aligned or whatever, that it makes a measurable difference. And part of that's because it's more engaging, part of that is because it's more real, and it's an opportunity for students to take what they think and bring it to life. So anyhow, I will leave it there. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in, and I will either write back or I will try to answer now if you're on the live session. If you have any questions about anything that has been sort of displayed or discussed here, either for me or just sort of in general, feel free to reach out to Mary Ellen DeLacy. She's a STEM curriculum specialist here at KnowAtom. My name's Francis Vigent. I was a co-founder of the company about 10 years ago, and I function as the CEO here. I'm a former teacher, as I mentioned earlier. And feel free to reach out to her. There's going to be a second part of the series, which you can access, register, and view online. Just go to knowatom.com/strategically to register and review it on demand. And these are places where you can find other resources. The curriculum and reader samples that I mentioned. We have a lot more than that. Like I showed in the pictures, we provide curriculum, professional development, soup to nuts kind of stuff. But we have free samples, and feel free to take a look, model your own after, or adopt, or if you are in a position of evaluating resources and trying to adopt something as a district, we're more than happy to help you out there too. The other resources, unfortunately, are for purchase, I guess is what I'm saying. So there are free samples, but beyond that, the other things we have are, are not free. The case studies, there's some case studies there too. You can check out results, and please stay connected. It's all free. KnowAtom.com/blog. You can subscribe to our blog. Follow us on Facebook. Check us out on Twitter @KnowAtom. And there are some additional free live and on-demand webinars, resources, things on Socratic dialogue. There's, I think, a great hour, really takes you through how to hold a Socratic dialogue, what that means in a next-generation environment, among other pieces, which you can find at knowatom.com/resources. I'll check out if there are any questions, which I don't believe there are. So unless you have questions you'd like to drop in, I will wish you a wonderful day. And I hope that you found this time helpful and informative, and I wish you luck on your pursuit of the next generation science standards. They are fantastic for kids, and as a teacher myself, I really am optimistic about what next generation science standards mean for our future citizens and for the future of our public schools in terms of thinking, really focusing on thinking and focusing on equipping students with things that really matter. So thank you again for your time, and I wish you a great day. Bye-bye.